Louisiana history today will be our topic. To give you a little bit of background about Louisiana first, and then to talk about how Louisiana slavery was distinct, especially when we compare it to other parts of the world, the Caribbean and the Atlantic world, and compare it to British slavery, which we're probably most familiar with. So the colony begins, Louisiana, as a way for France to secure the Mississippi River and to stop the British movements west. In other words, to actually go and colonize that part of the world, what the French hope to accomplish is outflank the British. And what they like to do is obviously connect areas of Canada all the way to the Gulf South. Now, this slide represents the French, again, meeting with Native Americans. It's obviously an idealized version of what took place, but it is LaSalle staking claim to the areas of the southern Mississippi, only to try to return there later on and be unsuccessful. But it's the French decide to establish themselves at 2 points on the map. First, of course, is Biloxi, followed by Mobile in 1699 and after 1700. They follow that up with other areas. So we might typically think of Louisiana as Louisiana, the colony, and later the state as we know it, and make connections with Natchitoches and New Orleans, but that's just not the case. In its infancy, Louisiana was a couple of places along the Gulf. And it was for the effort of the French to make sure that they didn't abandon the area, which they knew was strategically important. They also knew if they gave it to the English, they'd have control. They already were seeing influence of what happens when the British were operating in areas of the Carolinas. It's the idea of, dropping a rock into a pond. You can see the ripple effects happen as Carolina was established as a colony after 1670. So we've got a couple of individuals, the Iberville brothers, who associated with Louisiana. And they were trying to develop the colony as early as the end of the 17th century or the 1600s. It is Iberville who petitions King Louis, obviously the colony is named after him, to start this area and to also start maybe possibly bringing slaves over. The biggest challenge for France is what kind of money will they end up spending in the colony? They know they have to get people to leave the nation of France. Already, Canada had been established since the early 1600s, never always getting the people they would like to have as colonists, and they had to make adjustments for that, where the English could count on folks who were pursuing economic interest or religious dissenters, such as the Pilgrims and Puritans who came to New England. So they had to rely on the French. If you don't have that same push factor to leave the old country, to leave France, you had to rely on a more, let's just say, troublesome part of the population. As they began, the French did, to connect Canada to the Mississippi River Valley. The king, Louis XIV, didn't want this to be the policy. Do we want the dregs of society, criminals, to be sent to these new colonies? But that policy ended up changing after his death, and the rationale was we have to get somebody there. I mean, every European country was using the colonies as a dumping ground to send the people either out of debt or out of prisons, or we might also say folks in the military who were the equivalent of missing in action, who would try to escape or go AWOL, absent without leave, or any circumstance like that where they wanted to, again, fill the colony with someone. And those folks who you would think would be successful maybe didn't have the same initiative to leave. So from 1717 onwards in the colony of Louisiana, you could have your sentence commuted if you were a condemned prisoner, if you go to the new colony. And so prisoners would be brought typically to shipyards along the coast of France under heavy guard and chained on ships until they were full, and then making their way towards the New World. So again, deserting soldiers, those who had gone absent without the time of their service being actually over, vagabonds, drunks, murderers, troublesome family members or neighbors that you didn't like and you had the ability to ship them off, were those who typically went to both Canada and Louisiana. You also got kind of a finder's fee. That was nice. If you or a member of a special police force if you could round up potential recruits to the colony. And the English did it. The English did it to, again, take any orphans who might have been lingering around and put them on a ship, or someone who was, again, busy becoming an alcoholic, where you could just kind of have them make a mark as an indenture, and they would make their way forcefully or with some, again, incentive to go over to the colonies in the New World. Things got so bad, and the reputation for the colony and for the stories of going to the colony were so bad that by about 1720, riots began to break out in areas of France among those who were condemned to go to Louisiana. And I setting the stage for this because it's going to tell you the difficulty at which the French have to actually create this colony, and the problem that they had as far as a labor force. The model for the French for the development of Louisiana, and you can show this here. This is the Gulf Coast. It perhaps doesn't look too much like it, but you can see marked on the map in the middle there, New Orleans, and you can also see the Mississippi River and some of the other areas that the French would have been familiar with as they are along the border between both French Louisiana and Spanish Tejas. Okay, so back to this idea that the model for the French development in Louisiana was this area. This is Saint-Domingue. This, once upon a time, had been Hispaniola as far as the Spanish had called it during the time of Columbus and afterwards, where this section of the island was controlled by the French and the other side by the Spanish. In many ways, if you're familiar at all with the story of Carolina, Carolina is created because of Barbados planters who come from that tiny English West Indies island and arrive with slaves after 1670 and eventually create these giant plantations that are devoted to rice and indigo. So it's an abandoned part, a western third, we might say, of the old Santo Domingo colony from the Spanish. And the French were able to get it going around 1660. And the French had, and the connections between Saint-Domingue and Louisiana obviously are there. You're going to be reading about attempted slave rebellions, and of course the most successful one, that is one of the most influential in all of the Western Hemisphere, the one that Frederick Douglass said that slaves in the United States were familiar with in the early 1800s. But that's for a different story. For now, we're going to talk about the idea that France had, at the time of the establishment of Louisiana, about 30,000 slaves in their different Caribbean islands. And this is a year roughly about the time that LaSalle was ready to sail and make his way down the Mississippi River. They don't have a lot of indentures, where the English relied on indentured servants and then sometimes moved to bringing in slaves. Overwhelmingly, those who were forced into labor in Saint-Domingue were of African descent. By the middle of the 1700s, sugarcane becomes the dominant cash crop operated there by France. So overwhelming majorities of African and African Americans there on Saint-Domingue. It is the greatest producer, Saint-Domingue, the colony, of sugar in America. And they also supplement sugar by growing coffee, having extensive coffee plantations. So the Crown, with their high-minded goals, and the officials who are on the ground don't always see eye to eye in the development of Saint-Domingue, and that really would apply to the development of Louisiana. Once upon a time, early in Louisiana's history, as many other different European powers attempted to enslave Indians, have a successful Indian population that was enslaved, and a successful Indian slave trade. Certainly that was the story of the British in Carolina after 1680. It's, you can imagine, very dangerous pursuit to be involved in. At one point, those who were in the area of Louisiana had an offer to trade 2 Indian slaves. They could send from Louisiana for 1 black slave taken from Saint-Domingue, but that idea didn't get, again, a lot of support. But it always represents, in some ways, the idea that the first really industry out of Carolina is what? The Indian slave trade, because they came from Barbados and realized they need to get slaves any way they can. It wasn't clear that African slavery was going to be the key to their labor force, but enslaving Indians was fraught with problems, and that didn't like, and it caused, as we will see, a great deal of unsettlement in uh, Indian areas of Carolina among the Indian people, where you, as the English, would quickly change sides and say, well, you, one of the petite nations that's along the Carolina coast, will throw you over as our ally because your rival can get us more Indian slaves, and now we're going to end up enslaving you. Again, it's part of the unfortunate history of the world that this was a business, and it was often brought out the worst of people. In the colonies early on of Louisiana, things looked pretty bad. It is Bienville, one of the two brothers, who is given supervision of the colony and almost single-handedly runs it until about 1740. There weren't a lot of slaves in Louisiana early on. Probably an early census in about 1712, so we're even predating when the colony moved onto the Mississippi River at New Orleans. There were probably 10 Africans, maybe, in the different sections of Louisiana in 1712. In this early period, they attempted to use indentured servants, and they usually got a year and a half long contract, and typically about 36 months to clear land and labor on some of these small farms and plantations. This was going to change dramatically. The idea of, would it be slaves? Would it be servants? Sometime after 1719. And this is when several ships from the west coast of Africa started to bring into the colony of Louisiana. They had captured rice farmers who were from areas of West Africa that the French would have been familiar with. And that was one of the plants and crops that became critical in Louisiana's history. So you have enslaved Africans as part of the labor force, European indentured servants, and they also use some labor of Native Americans. We think early on there were many more Indian slaves that were laboring in the colony than African slaves. So that leads us to, again, talk about how the institution of slavery grew and accelerated in the colony of Louisiana. That had to do with slaves entering individually early on, when those who were Atlantic travelers, French colonists, would bring them in. One named John Mingo came from South Carolina. He was imported from one colony to another. He had experience there. We have stories and some of the background information of some of these individuals. A servant or a cook might be brought in individually. So what you wanted to do in the case of Louisiana, with any success of being successful, any idea, any chance of being successful, is to try to stimulate more settlement there. And one of the keys for that was to have an investment company, and that investment company was going to actually bring in more people and more slaves. In 1718, we see the formation of what's called the Company of the Indies. This was a Ponzi scheme, to kind of give you a more modern term. It was one of those things that never really had a chance to succeed because it lacked investment. The investors weren't exactly honest individuals. And in 1718, it is the group that runs the Company of the Indies that decides we're going to move the base of operations for our colony along a bend in the Mississippi River, New Orleans. And this is the plan. This is dated in 1763. So interestingly enough, it's actually dating from when the Spanish would have taken over New Orleans at the French and Indian War. But it should look familiar if you know anything about the actual early city. It's the grid pattern that prevented, ideally, fires from happening, although New Orleans always seemed to be plagued with fires. What you would do in this early plan outside the boundaries of the city is that the Company of the Indies gave generous grants of land, and it gave land in long, narrow riverfront farms Again, this would be outside the confines of the city early on. And these farms were routinely be made up of about 170 acres. So that was fairly significant. And the Company of the Indies also seriously invested in bringing in more settlers, both white and black. The company transported early on in its infancy about 5,400 Europeans and 6,000 Africans. So overwhelmingly, this was going to be a serious investment, and the majority of the population was enslaved. This is where the story of Louisiana slavery is rather unique, because slaves who first arrived in Louisiana came in the same way as other colonies early on. They were smuggled in as small groups. I kind of hinted at that with the servants or cooks or individual who would move to the colony. And then with the advent of the Company of the Indies, you have a majority of them coming from the Senegambia region in West Africa, in between the Senegal and the Gambia rivers. This region had been an early destination for Europeans, meaning it was realized the potential of getting slaves going back several centuries. And then it seemed to have lost some of the prominence and the idea that the European countries would go further south towards the empires south of the equator, like the Congo Empire, for example. But France, to its advantage in this case, when we're talking about slavery in this region and connecting it to Louisiana, France controlled exclusive trading rights in this area, and those rights were then given to the Company of the Indies. So this they will know in Europe as the Senegambia region. It's a tropical zone in West Africa, widely open, as you can see, to the Atlantic on the right-hand side of this slide. It is in between the Sahara Desert as far as its climate and makeup, and some of the tropical forests a little bit further south in the areas known as Guinea. So you've got two rivers that connect the interior along to the coast. It's the Senegal River, and the river, hence that's where it gets its name. And people of the interior can move on both rivers. The Bambara people, the Mandingo people, would have been obviously familiar with those areas, and they were sold as slaves. The Gambia River is the main route where you can penetrate into the continent from the coast and get into the hinterland. And it also is the marker that divides the two sections, typically called Northern Senegambia, where you have a lot of political entities and constructions, hierarchical societies where slavery did exist. They grew different crops, including millet was one of the major principal food crops. They were followers of Islam in this particular region. It was a principal religion, but it also was incorporated with some of their more traditional African practices. Up until about 1742, we know that the trade of Senegal was a monopoly of the French Company of the West Indies, and they were located at the mouth of the Senegal River. You can see it marked on the map there, just above 16 latitude, marked St. Louis. Other areas, beyond the mouth of the Senegal River, you have Goree Island, which was along that region, the principal area where both you took items and slaves. And again, we know from this story, and from reading the Equiano book, that they built these impressive fortifications to protect their investment in the slave trade. So the trade of the Gambia River was under control of the British, who competed with the French in that region. And the Bambara and the Mandingo people were among some of the most frequent ethnicities on Louisiana plantations, and contributed very deeply to some of the things we connect with Louisiana culture. The wearing of masks goes, of course, and connects to the Mardi Gras Indians of New Orleans. And that's interesting. I think that what makes Louisiana slavery unique is that we're talking about one region, not slaves scattered from different parts of West Africa, some of which went to the Caribbean first and then were, in the English model, brought up to the American colonies. But that gives you a little idea about Senegambia. It is, again, where the Company of the Indies had the legal right to take slaves, and this is where they brought them in that period of about 20 years where they ran the colony. We don't have a lot of records of Africans in the colony of Louisiana much before 1710 or 1708. Bienville had tried to bring some in on his own to serve in his own capacity. Sometimes, if you were to travel, if you were a colonist in Louisiana and well connected and well to do, you would often move back and forth from Louisiana to the French Caribbean colonies, and you could make purchases or capture individual slaves. Although the crown wasn't exactly thrilled with that idea, it happened anyway. This was always the problem with Louisiana. It's so far off the map. It is the last destination for any Atlantic ship because most of them go in between Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Some make their way as the American colonists became more significant and economically important. But as far as the French were concerned, moving on beyond the Caribbean islands to Louisiana, this kind of backwater area that didn't have anything worth getting or picking up, at least initially, that's why there were these complaints about Louisiana colonists saying we're constantly cut off from the outside world. So we know a little bit about this, the Middle Passage. We know that sometimes shiploads could average as high as 400. So you could routinely get 400 Africans on some of these Middle Passage ships from regions like the Bambaras region, which is areas of the Senegal River. In this case, we know that many were war captives. They were taken from the interior of the continent and brought to the coast. Along the coast, they would work in different capacities, work in as domestics, household slaves, boatmen, clerks, interpreters for the French, and warfare, long warfare between the different sections of the Senegambia region also made them slave catchers and ideal as soldiers. French officials often took a Bambara wife, as one Louisiana official with a mixed race spouse eventually would say. They are strong, gentle, tractable, and faithful, not subject to sullenness or to runaway as the Guinea Negroes frequently are, unquote. This means that for Louisiana, they predominantly take slaves from one particular region of the west coast of Africa. They are now the ones traveling to Louisiana. They are kidnapped. They are often kidnapped as a result of war and things that happen and are unsettling in that part of the world. The other issue for Louisiana, and this is, I think, applicable to all colonies in their infancy, is that both slaves and whites die at an alarming rate, as do Indian slaves as well. This is one of the reasons why many colonies decide to completely abandon the idea of having Indian slaves. This also produces more of a reliance on slave labor. So you bring in over the course of several years, early on, under the Company of the Indians, about 2,000 slaves. And then in 1720, we know that about another 700 or so arrive after surviving this very harsh voyage across the ocean, with stops in the French West Indies. They would take on more supplies and make their way all the way to the Delta region of the Gulf. And at this point, very weakened slaves who have extended the Middle Passage. You're not simply going from West Africa to the Caribbean islands, Barbados being one of the shortest trips. Louisiana would be, again, much larger, longer trip. And you have to understand that these Africans would be unfamiliar with the area and strangers in this colony. One particular Middle Passage voyage is a ship called the Venus. It was packed with upwards of 450 Africans. This was a ship that's documented in 1729. 363 of those actually survive and make it to the Mississippi River area. Most of the survivors die in the first few weeks in the colony. A lot of the slaves who did survive were younger men. Slaves have, as we know, some immunity to malaria, but they can't guard against pneumonia, yellow fever. But it's discovered by the colonists in Louisiana that Africans survive better than Europeans or Native Americans. And they request more and more, at least in the infancy and purchases, the infancy of the colony, young men wanted to, again, be stronger and to be able to do the labor for longer required of getting the colony up off the ground. By 1731, there are an impressive number, 4,000 Africans in the colony of Louisiana, which make up at this point about 60% of the population. And it grows more quickly than the white population. Slavery in Louisiana had been born from this concentrated effort by the Company of the Indies, even though they are not around very long as a corporation because of their mismanagement and the fact that they lose money. And Louisiana doesn't really turn a profit as far as the French system of colonies. In some ways, it mirrored Canada to the north. You got to spend the money there, but if you don't spend the money, you have to abandon it, and that would turn it over to the Spanish, or even worse, the English. Trying to get a profit out of this enterprise and make sure that their stockholders back in France are satisfied, the Company of the Indies attempts to employ slaves at all kinds of professions. Most work in the area around New Orleans. They create levees, they construct docks. Other are boatmen. That's a direct experience to their lives back in West Africa. They go as far north as the Illinois country up into the regions of the Mississippi River. They are skilled at those tasks from their earlier life before they were captured in Africa. There are also skilled artisans who are trained in certain professions. And the company themselves, again, the main force that's running the colony, again, keeps some of them so they can get the profits back to the Company of the Indies directly. All slaves early on, when the company ran the colony, had to devote 30 days of work, which would be, again, to realize the profits for the company and not for the owners. This is the often requirements of this huge legal right that you give, in this case, the entity of the Company of the Indies. So the center of the colony is Louisiana, and the center of that section is New Orleans. Built in 1718, most slaves are employed around this area. It's at a crossroads of trade, and the French decided to move it because they thought their coastal areas, Biloxi and Mobile, were quite a bit more vulnerable to attack. And maybe they were right, especially when you consider how quickly Carolina was expanding in the English colonies. There you would see in New Orleans a real mix of individuals, Indian trappers. There were Canadian woodsmen who had made their way down along the Mississippi River and other rivers to the north, French soldiers, and you would see sailors of all types of nationalities. France had a legal code by which they set about governing slaves. And once again, go back to the slave here. There we go. To the slave code known as the Code Noir. It was first established in 1685. Obviously, it would have been applicable to the colonies in the West Indies. It was later applied to Louisiana as of 1724. This would have made sense. It's not long after the first large shipments of Africans arrive in the colony. What the Code Noir does is declare chattel slaves as chattel property without any rights. They could not own anything. It also gives owners enormous power to discipline slaves, more power than they had over white indentured servants or even Indian slaves. It does provide, however, some legal protection for slaves. There's an expectation that slaves would be instructed in learning the Catholic Church, sometimes could be baptized. Any freed slave by who was manumitted would be given full equal rights. That was interesting. It was going to be the creation of the first significant population of free people of color. This was rather unique in the slave system. Uh, as a counter in Virginia, if you manumitted or freed a slave, if you were the owner and you decided to do it for whatever reason, you typically had to pay the expense of sending the former slave, the freedman, as the word would be, out of the colony. There's not a lot of evidence that the Code Noir was followed in all aspects. Some plantation slaves were not even familiar with the laws, and if they remain ignorant of some of the rights that they had because their owner wasn't telling them about that, you can understand where this could lead to some fairly brutal treatment. Because rules were typically hard to enforce, interracial unions in the colony of Louisiana were typical and did happen more often than in other parts of colonial North America. A white man with a black woman would not be unknown in the French colony. The free black population in New Orleans after 1722 oftentimes is given, if they are manumitted by their owner, freedom in this small French town in New Orleans. Like the color line, we might say, in these colonies was not very severely drawn. Even Carolina, which we think had a pretty strict slave code, and it did. It was based on the code of Barbados, which would have been, again, reflective of the fact that there were more enslaved colonists than actually British colonists. Like Carolina early on, color was not always the indicative of your status. Some bought slaves in the colony based on their own individual skill, just as you can see in Carolina, the idea that freedom could be given to slaves who were part of the militia. Louis Congo is an example from Louisiana as a colony. He was brought to the colony because he was skilled as an executioner. He could carry this out not only against anyone who the colony deemed worthy of execution, but it also included, among other things, French soldiers who were sent to the colony and tried to leave before their service was over. Louis Congo was so skilled at his job that he made demands of the leadership of the colony, which were granted. He demanded freedom for his wife. He demanded for the jobs that he performed, committing executions, goods be provided for him. Other free blacks came from Spanish Mexico or Carolina. Although the French didn't like the idea, it's all often like the French crown trying to say, no, we're going to rely on indentured servitude in the infancy, the early years of Louisiana. And then, of course, those who were the colonists who could to the islands were bringing slaves kind of under the radar. And so it forces the French to deal with it. Free people of color were brought into the colony from the start, and that's why the Code Noir reflected that. Another challenge for Louisiana as a colony is that it failed to grow a successful crop. I mentioned before, few ships were traveling back and forth from any places, but in addition to the Atlantic Islands and Europe and Africa. 4 ship captains to take the trip the rest of the way, to go from these West Indies islands, such as Guadeloupe, which was very profitable for the French. They said it's not worth our while to go to Louisiana because what are we going to get there? The tobacco grade isn't very good. There is some indigo, but it often fails. It's not of the same quality of other places. There is a small industry in Louisiana of cutting down trees for naval stores. That means pitch and tar and turpentine that you need to waterproof ships. The second problem is between the colony leadership and Indians in the area. When Bienville decides to move Louisiana to the Mississippi River in the second decade of the 18th century, at that point, Louisiana authorities jump in the middle of an Indian civil war. And the French were very good at sowing a lot of hatred between not only Indian groups which already existed, but between and Indians who would often, the French, use in their militia. This is a connection back to slaves from Africa, being those that were brought over, captured, brought to the colony of Louisiana. To extend their control of the Mississippi River, this is a artist's conception of Fort Rosalie, which is built among the Natchez Indians. One of the first things that Bienville had to do is stop a civil war between the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians, and a lot of that had to do with the Indian slave trading that was demanded of the leadership of the colony of Carolina. So that was finally settled by the two brothers in the early years of the existence of the colony. Angry Indians, as the French tried to expand, again, north out of areas of New Orleans towards, this is near, again, Natchez, modern day Natchez, Mississippi. So they build the fort. Those inside the fort demand more land being given up by the Natchez Indians, and they revolt. They revolt in 1729. This is the fabled Natchez. As a result, about a tenth of the population of Louisiana is killed by this sudden attack. Also, and almost as damaging, the loss of those were the 200 slaves that were taken by Native Americans after the attack. The French were terrified, not only at this act, but the fact that many African slaves had joined the Indian rebels in the Natchez Revolt. And so to try to, again, even the odds, bring about revenge and retribution, the leadership of Louisiana bringing Choctaw Indians to attack, and the Indians, not surprisingly, will see that slaves can help hold the balance of power. They are almost an equal part of the population in the 1720s. So the Natchez Rebellion, and another attempted rebellion that takes place. It's known as the Samba Bambara slave rebellion. In this case, it's a conspiracy more than a rebellion. This is kind of a somewhat fictionalized, not exactly accurate, and the artists take a lot of liberty with this. But Samba Bambara tried to engineer an Indian slave alliance that had helped the cause of the Natchez Indians. Samba captured and was later dismembered by the French in this conspiracy and attempted attack. The French were very careful at this point who they actually allowed in the militia. And out of the result of these two events, the Natchez Rebellion and the Samba conspiracy, it began to change the life for slaves who lived in the Mississippi River Valley after 1729. These events are literally happening side by side. So Louisiana was at first, and this is a designation that we've come across in discussions of American Atlantic slavery. At first, it was a society with slaves, but more and more became a slave society with a group who was overwhelmingly unfree labor in a majority over those who were the free laborers. But it had many of the trappings of the society with slaves. That's why it's accurate to call it that. As much as the slave owners had tried plantations and to try to concentrate their workforce, it was spread out. There were Indian traders, there were Canadians and French. It's quite a unique makeup in the infancy of the colony. So it's, to say it a different way, there was a lot of unique features in Louisiana slavery, as opposed to the systems in the other English colonies. And that's why I wanted to point this out and go into some detail that may not be there in the book. The proportion of blacks to whites in the colony began to dramatically rise after 1721. And with that, those colonists, white colonists coming to the colony, nearly stopped. Among the group that came over in that first company of the Indies, the 6,000 or so Africans who came to the colony, followed by a much group. and then, of course, the Europeans who arrived. It doesn't, in fact, was an interesting dilemma here and an interesting, we might say, characteristic of slavery in Louisiana. It doesn't lead to a fragmentation of a lot of the black communities. On the contrary, it leads to a rather autonomous and we might say well integrated, a self confident African population, a population where free people of color are allowed and given certain rights and privileges. And that's very different than the white population who wants this plantation economy to develop, but won't develop until late. Someone once said that Louisiana is a lot like a poor version of Carolina, where you have effectively an African and African American majority over the white colonists, but for decades it struggled to produce a cash crop that was the equivalent of, tobacco being the boom crop in Virginia or rice and indigo in areas of South Carolina. So among the settlers in Louisiana, you've got this mix, the soldiers that the French need to keep order there. Officials and the officials and the colonists are always at odds because unlike the British colonies, you don't have any kind of formal legislature. You just have kind of an appointed military governor, something of a council. And again, they always complain that there wasn't self-government in the colony, but that really wasn't the practice as far as both the French and the Spanish. So the conditions were often chaotic in Louisiana. You had an Indian population, you had a slave population from one particular part of West Africa. It was a heavily Africanized culture taken from the same area, not like the British colonies were along the Atlantic, where many of the slaves to areas of Carolina and up and down the British Atlantic coast were from the West Indies. Not the case in Louisiana. So again, an integral part of the history of the colony. We're going to have some more resources to talk about this subject, especially those who can talk about it in a little more detail than I can and have some more, we might say, expert knowledge in the area. But this, again, kind of paints a little bit of a picture of the challenges that the colony had, how it was addressed by the Company of the Indies, and they're critical to the part of the story, where Africans who were moved forcibly out of that continent to Louisiana, where they were from, their background, that they were from one region, and that they were part of a movement that took place over a short number of years, and then, for the most part, slowed down as far as the French control of the colony. That's all of what makes Louisiana slavery unique and different than what we're probably used to when we're discussing it with the Spanish model or even the English model.